We've reached the end of our discussion of inductive reasoning, or argument by example. And we talked about the importance of consistencies in arguments. We've talked about the role that an analogy can play in providing an example to help advance an argument. We've talked about the importance of evidence in an argument and how the evidence gets put forward. And we've talked about the importance of inference to the best explanation. The strength of all of those arguments depends on the strength of the reasons found in support of it. And the strength of those reasons will always ever be probabilistic, right? There will always be a probability that it doesn't work out perfectly. Never a certainty, but always a probability. And we rely on more or less probabilities in order to live our daily life, right? I mean, every time you get in a car, there's a very good chance that you will arrive safely at your destination. There is also a chance that you will be in a car accident. The probabilities are pretty much on your side if you engage in safe, defensive driving, if you stay mindful of everything, you don't text and drive, you don't become distracted, you don't daydream, you don't allow yourself to be overly distracted, eat while you're driving and so forth. But even if you drive perfectly safely, perfectly defensively, there's still always an opportunity, a chance that you might be in an automobile accident. That's a probability that we accept. We accept lots of probabilities every single day in our life. They just feel very second nature to us because we accept them every single day. Arguments sometimes draw those probabilities to the surface and ask us to embrace them right there on the surface. And we may not be 100% willing to do that, but we have to work through and think logically. There is another approach to argumentation that Aristotle outlines in Rhetoric, and that's argument by enthymeme, or what we might call deductive reasoning. So what's the difference between inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning? Deductive reasoning is driven by an internal logic. What we mean by that is with induction, we find specific examples that we can draw a general conclusion from. Think about the example that I provided of the mouse in the kitchen. I see a plate left on the counter, crumbs around the plate, marks in the food. I see little black, almost rice-shaped things on the counter. And I look up on Google what they are, and somebody on Google says, those look like mouse droppings. I don't see a mouse. I look at specific things, and I'm able to draw a general conclusion from that specific information. There's a mouse in my kitchen that I'm going to need to take care of, to address in some way. Deduction works in the opposite way. So we start with general premises. These are more like principles that are at play. And when the principles are added up together, we can draw a specific conclusion from those principles. So deductive reasoning moves in the opposite direction of inductive reasoning, whereas inductive reasoning relies on evidence that we find out in the world to support the claim. Deductive reasoning has a sort of internal logic to it. When all the pieces kind of line up and snap together, there's a sense of strength that comes in the argument. This is usually the point in the discussion of the logos appeal that I make a joke about Legos, right? The brick toys, the way that they snap together is a sense in which logic, the strength of the logic depends on the way the information is snapping together. So let's compare back and forth the difference between enthymeme and example, just to continue this discussion a little bit. And I want to return to the example that I mentioned around inductive reasoning and cannabis legalization. So if we use argument by example, right, we're gonna ask ourselves, should we legalize cannabis in our state? If we're going to be looking by example, we might want to look at what other states have done. In the states that have legalized cannabis for recreational use, can we extrapolate how the legalization affected their state? What were the benefits? What were the consequences? Let's weigh the benefits and the consequences. Do the benefits outweigh the consequences, or do the consequences outweigh the benefits? That's looking out at other examples. All of that is probabilistic. All of that is an estimation. We can't say for certain that if we do it in our state, that that's exactly what's going to happen, but we might have a very good estimation. We might say that there's a very good chance it's going to happen. We can then use those examples to support the case that we're making for our own state and how legalizing for recreational use would support our own state in a way that other states have been supported, right? We're using specific examples to draw a general conclusion. The specific example, how has this impacted those states? The general conclusion, deciding what we should do for our own state. But what if there is no example to turn to, right? What about, like, think about the state of Colorado back in the early 2010s when no state had legalized cannabis for recreational use, right? Colorado can't look at what other states are doing. Or think about California in the 1990s when they were in the process of legalizing medicinal cannabis. There was no example to turn to in the United States. So how do you make up your mind when you don't have an example to turn to? Or what if the examples have incomplete data? Okay? What if the data is, the probabilities associated with the data are like 50-50? What if the data is incomplete? What if the data can only be interpreted in not just one way, but like in a lot of different ways? What if the outcomes with the examples are unclear? Right? Aristotle says argument by example is really important, that we rely on argument by example, and we do so every day. But Aristotle urges us to remember that examples are only probabilistic. Examples can change over time. So our best play is to argue with internal logic, with overarching principles that we can use to establish our footing. That's going to ensure that we have a strong argument that is less vulnerable. I have on the slide, it says not vulnerable, but less vulnerable to criticisms. And certainly if we have arguments about evidence, then we can get into all sorts of conversations about, well, is that good evidence? Is there better evidence? Is this study good? Is that study good? Which study is better? So on and so forth. But if we can find common principles to argue from, then that's going to make our argument stronger. Now, that's really at its core what an enthymeme is. An enthymeme is an argumentative statement that's driven by its internal logic. It's got the claim and it's got support for the claim, kind of built into the statement. There's often a logical middle that goes unstated, right? But the audience member or reader can absolutely understand the point that's being made by reading the enthymeme. So when we talk about enthymemes, we're just talking about a sentence that has a logic, an internal logic to it. Enthymemes are sort of compressions of big arguments then. And we can map an enthymeme to see how its logic is functioning. Now, I know you in the audience right now are looking at this and you're like, what are you even talking about? I still don't understand what an enthymeme is. And that's why I think I'm going to have to show you a few. So I've got some enthymemes lined up. Let's talk a little bit about them. Here's one. There are more dangerous substances than cannabis that are currently legal. So to maintain a prohibition against recreational cannabis is irrational. I'll read it again. There are more dangerous substances than cannabis that are currently legal. So to maintain a prohibition against recreational cannabis is irrational. Even if you don't agree, let's say you're an opponent of recreational cannabis, but even if you don't agree, I think you can probably sense, if you hit pause on this video and look at it and think about it, you can sense the internal logic that's kind of working here. At the risk of overstating it, I think it goes a little bit like this. Let's say we have three substances. We'll call them A, B, and C. They're dangerous, but they're legal. Okay? We have this other substance. Let's call it substance X. It is not as dangerous as A, B, and C, but substance X is illegal. So why is it rational for substance X to be illegal when substances A, B, and C are legal? It seems irrational, really, at its core, right? Like, we've got these other substances, they're legal, you can go buy them, right? They have to be a certain age, or you might have to show an ID, but like, they're legal, you can buy them. But we got this other substance that's not as dangerous, and yet you can't buy it. Seems irrational. Doesn't rely on an analogy. Doesn't rely on evidence, although evidence can be brought in to strengthen the case. Doesn't really rely on inference to the best explanation. Does rely a little bit on consistency, but remember, consistency underlines all of the logos appeal, not just inductive reasoning, but all of the logos appeal. So there's a kind of internal logic to this statement that we can just look at the statement on its own and think a little bit about the way that the statement is functioning. So we're more likely to say that the enthymeme in a discussion, or we're more likely to write it in a paper than we are to kind of lay it out like this. So in other words, you're more likely to see like bullet point number 1 in a paper, right, than you are to see bullet point number 2 in a paper. Bullet point number 1 is the sort of thing we'd say in a debate, or the sort of thing we'd write in a paper. But bullet point number 2 is the professor coming in and like really kind of like hitting the hammer over your head to like make the obvious case. Right? Aristotle's point, though, is that with an enthymeme, we can sense the internal logic and how it's working. That's really what's important for the argument, in the sense that the idea stands separate from, what other states are doing. It creates a stronger footing that is going to become a little more universal rather than a little more dependent on the variables, right? I mean, like if look, if you want to write a paper on the recreational use of cannabis, legalizing the recreational use of cannabis, ask yourself the question, if all other states had no tax revenue and the crime rates didn't go down, and traffic fatalities didn't go down, and tobacco use didn't go down, and alcohol use didn't go down, and mental health issues didn't go up, would you still want it legalized? And if the answer is yes, then you're not really relying on the evidence from the other states to make the case. Then there's something else. There's like some sort of principle that you're actually after at that point, right? Maybe the principle is the government does not have a role in telling its citizens what substances they can and can't use. Maybe that's your principle. Maybe your principle is, look, we have laws that do protect people from things that are dangerous. Here's a thing that's not as dangerous as other stuff that's legal. And so doesn't make a whole lot of sense to prohibit this one thing that's not legal, or to prohibit this one thing that's less dangerous than these other things that are all legal. Right? When we lay out an enthymeme, right, we take the sort of the sentence level and we really kind of lay out what are all the parts of this enthymeme. How are they all functioning together? What are the principles that are driving this internal logic? When we lay all that out, it's called a syllogism, right? So now we have these two kind of weird vocab words, enthymemes and syllogisms. But really, you can just think an enthymeme is a logical statement, internal logic, and a syllogism is the map of the logic. Okay? So the map of the logic in the enthymeme that I already provided looks a little bit like this, right? Number one, laws exist to protect people. That's why we have laws. They protect people in the society, right? They either protect people on an individual level or they protect all of society. Alcohol, tobacco, and many narcotics are legal substances. 21 years old, you can buy alcohol and tobacco. Although it used to be lower than that, but it is 21 now. And many narcotics require a photo ID or a prescription, but they are legal to have. Right? 3, cannabis is less dangerous than alcohol, tobacco, and other legal narcotics. Can't overdose on it like you can with alcohol. Doesn't have the same link to cancer that tobacco does. Doesn't have the same overdose or organ damaging prospects that other legal narcotics have. Less dangerous. Therefore, right, laws exist to protect people. Alcohol, tobacco, and many narcotics are legal. Cannabis is less dangerous than those. Therefore, cannabis shouldn't be prohibited to a greater degree than alcohol, tobacco, and other legal narcotics. Doesn't mean throw open the doors, but you gotta be 21 to buy alcohol, gotta be 21 to buy tobacco. Well, you've got to be 21 to buy cannabis. Or maybe you need to have a prescription to buy it. Or maybe you need to be pre-approved by the government to be able to buy it, right? I mean, you could put some various things on there, but shouldn't be prohibited to a greater degree than those things, right? Is this logically persuasive? I think for some people it would be. I think there's a certain logical strength when number 1 plus number 2 plus number 3 comes together because they seem to equal number 4. We've mapped out the argument. I want to take a look at some enthymemes that are part of a very famous text by Martin Luther King Jr. So in April 1963, while protesting segregation laws in Alabama, King was arrested and was placed in the Birmingham City Jail. From jail, he composed a letter to clergymen in Birmingham defending the activities of the civil rights protesters and defending the philosophical mission of the movement. He draws a lot, by the way, on Socrates in his letter which makes it a nice fit to what we're reading in our course. It has the title Letter from Birmingham Jail. It's one of the most powerful arguments that have emerged out of the civil rights movement. It's a masterpiece of American rhetoric. And if you haven't read Letter from Birmingham Jail, you absolutely have to. I can give you a copy if you'd like. You can't graduate college without reading Letter from Birmingham Jail. If I had my way, that would be a requirement. So let's take a look at an enthymeme from Letter from Birmingham Jail. King writes, all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. Okay, just focus on that statement. Let's read it again. All segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality. In the letter, King spends a lot of time talking about the difference between just laws and unjust laws. Segregation, he argues, is an unjust law. Right? It targets and it harms a particular group of people. It is a law designed to exclude, to make inferior, to degrade, to distort, to damage, to say you are less than, right? So if we take the enthymeme above, all segregation statutes are unjust because segregation distorts the soul and damages the personality, we could map it out as a syllogism, right? What's the end part, right? Sometimes when you're mapping it, it's a little easier to find what the end is, the claim that's being advanced, right? And I think that that's going to be our number 3, right? Segregation laws are unjust. That's the claim that King wants to make. But why are they unjust? Well, they are unjust because they damage people. They degrade them. They make them less than human. And a law that does that is unjust. Any law that does that is unjust. So we can take that argument now and write it out as a 1, 2, 3, right? Number 1, any law that degrades humans is unjust. Number 2, segregation laws degrade humans. 3, therefore segregation laws are unjust. I mean, those are some pretty tight Legos there, right? If number 1 is true, that any law that degrades a human is unjust, and number 2 is also true, segregation laws degrade humans, well, then by definition, segregation laws have to be unjust. There is a tight, powerful logic to that. And the way that it works, you can see from the highlights here, right? Notice on number 1, any law that degrades humans is unjust. Segregation laws degrade humans. Therefore, segregation laws are unjust. What I'm trying to show here is that you've got 2 words in the first line, or 2 phrases in the first line, 2 in the second, and the third brings them together. So the unspoken middle here, right, is that any law that degrades a human is unjust. King doesn't explicitly say it in this one enthymeme. He does say it elsewhere in the letter, but not in this one statement. But when we read it, our brain fills in the middle piece, right? Why is a segregation law unjust? Because it distorts the soul and damages the personality. Why does that make it unjust? Well, because any law that does that is unjust. He draws it out for us to consider. Here's another one. An unjust law is a code that a numerical or power majority group compels a minority group to obey, but does not make binding on itself. That's difference made legal. So we might take this syllogism or this enthymeme and we might map it out like this, right? The syllogism that comes out of it might look like this. Number one, laws that are applied one-sidedly are unjust. You pass a law, it's only designed to affect one group, but it doesn't affect the other group. That's not just. Segregation laws are applied one-sidedly, right? The whole point of the segregation law is to exclude a group, to require things of certain groups that you don't require of your own group, to give yourself a position of superiority in the law. Therefore, segregation laws are unjust. Here's another one. It doesn't have a syllogism mapped out with it, but I think if you read it, you can see how a syllogism might come into being. King writes, a law is unjust if it is inflicted on a minority that, as a result of being denied the right to vote, had no part in enacting or devising the law. Who can say the legislature of Alabama, which set up the state's segregation laws, was democratically elected? Throughout Alabama, all sorts of devious methods are used to prevent Negroes from becoming registered voters. And there are some counties in which, even though Negroes constitute a majority of the population, not a single Negro is registered. How can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? So he talks about a law is unjust if the group that enacted it only had the power to enact it because they rigged the game. They actively disenfranchised people, prevented them from voting by law. Right? Not that they had an election that was fair and they lost or they won. Not that some people were allowed to vote that you wouldn't want to vote, but they were actively excluded from participating in the process. All sorts of devious methods are used to prevent people from becoming registered voters, and therefore the counties are the people who are being elected are not being fairly elected. And so he asks, can any law enacted under such circumstances be considered democratically structured? And the answer, of course, is no. So let's get back to our cannabis enthymeme, right? Let's return to it, familiarize ourselves with it again, right? There are more dangerous substances than cannabis that are currently legal. So to maintain a prohibition against recreational cannabis is irrational. The syllogism we created, that we could create for this, might and does look like this, right? Number one, laws exist to protect people. Number two, alcohol, tobacco, and many narcotics are legal substances. Number three, cannabis is less dangerous than alcohol, tobacco, and other legal narcotics. Four, therefore, cannabis should not be prohibited to a greater degree than alcohol, tobacco, and other legal narcotics. This is our syllogism. Let's introduce a couple new vocab words here, right? Number one, number two, and number three are called the premises of the syllogism. And number four is called the conclusion. You can recognize the conclusion because it almost always has a therefore to it, right? And it takes the shape of like 1 plus 2 plus 3 equals 4, right? 1 plus 2 plus 3, therefore 4. Or 1 plus 2, therefore 3. All syllogisms need at least 3 parts, but they can have more. They all require at least 3. 2 premises and a conclusion that follows. For a syllogism to be sound, that is logical, to be a logical argument, all the premises must be true, and the conclusion must follow. Okay? What do we mean by true and follow? Follow. Follow means if number one, number two, and number three are true, if all of those things are true, does it make sense for number four to follow that line of reasoning? Right? So if the point of laws is to protect people, and we have some substances that are legal and they are dangerous, and we have another substance that's less dangerous than the ones that are legal, therefore, does it make sense to say the less dangerous substance should not be held to a higher standard than the dangerous substances? I would say number four seems to logically follow here, right? If 1, 2, and 3 are true, 4 follows, right? I mean, all the information is laid out in 1, 2, and 3. Now, importantly, the conclusion can follow even if the premises aren't true, right? Imagine I have a syllogism that looks like this. All fish live in the water. A whale is a fish. Therefore, a whale lives in the water. The conclusion does follow, right? All fish live in the water. A whale is a fish. Whales live in the water. That follows, right? The problem is whales are not fish. Whales are mammals. Okay? So we also have to ask, are the premises true? Is number 1, number 2, and number 3 of this syllogism, are those premises true? Perhaps, perhaps not. Let's start with number 2. I think that's the easiest one to sort of put a check mark next to. Alcohol, tobacco, and many narcotics are legal substances. I don't think anybody's going to dispute that, right? Because it's true. They are. You know, I can walk down to the liquor store that's less than a mile from my house and buy alcohol right now if I've got my ID. I can walk even a shorter distance to the gas station near my store and buy a pack of cigarettes or beer that's on sale at the gas station as well, for that matter. And of course, many narcotics are legal substances. I can get a prescription for one. I can go to a pharmacist. I can get, you know, other kinds of narcotics that come sold over the counter or with a prescription, right? I don't think anybody's going to dispute number 2. Number 3, cannabis is less dangerous than alcohol, tobacco, and other legal narcotics. So I think this is true, but I could see where it would be debated, right? I think partly it depends on what we mean by dangerous. Dangerous to the body, dangerous to society, how much less dangerous, right? If alcohol and tobacco are very dangerous and cannabis is just like one step down, maybe it's the same level of danger. But depends what we mean by dangerous. So we'd have to be a little more specific here and define the term. What do we mean by dangerous? Maybe the premise needs to be strengthened a little bit. What about number 1, though? Laws exist to protect people. Seems, again, to me like this is true, but it could get us into a philosophical debate about the purposes of laws. When something should be illegal, when something shouldn't be illegal. We might want to define the term protect. We might even want to define the term people. We might even want to define the term law. Something could be decriminalized so that there are no legal penalties for it, but prohibited from being sold recreationally. So the issue might be a little more complex than the syllogism initially suggests. I think 2 is clearly true, but if we really look closely at it, we might say number 1, number 3, there might be a little reason to worry there. The point here is to say, if you want to counter an enthymeme or a syllogism, you want to try to fight logic with logic, you have to identify which of the premises, or which multiple premises, aren't true. Okay? If you really want to try to attack it, you want to show that one of the premises is not true. You also want to show how the conclusion, if possible, doesn't follow, but it's way more likely that the premises are going to be false than that the conclusion doesn't follow. Understanding how to criticize enthymemes and syllogisms is really essential for refutation and really essential for counter-argument. If you are arguing with somebody and they are logically making a case, you need to be able to understand what is the shape of their argument, and so you can identify the point where the argument falls apart. That is essential. And that's what we're going to be working on next week when we take a look at the Crito and Socrates and Crito debating whether Socrates should escape from jail. Establishing that a premise isn't true, though, doesn't mean the conclusion is wrong, right? So maybe we say, we got a problem with number 1, laws exist to protect people. I got a problem with it. I'm going to prove that it's not true. Boom, I prove that it's not true. Syllogism falls apart. That means we shouldn't legalize cannabis for recreational use. But it doesn't really mean that. It just means that particular argument didn't work. That particular syllogism doesn't work. Doesn't mean that the conclusion is wrong. Just now that we've shown that that syllogism doesn't work, the person who made the syllogism needs to make a better one. Maybe wants to be approached from a different angle. In the defense, Socrates offers up a couple of enthymemes. Let's just draw attention to a few of them briefly here. With our reputations in mind, yours and our whole cities, as well as my own, I believe any such behavior would be ignominious at my age and with the reputation I possess. So this is when he's talking about he's not going to beg for his life, right? Let's take this enthymeme and lay it out as a syllogism, right? Seems to me that this is the argument that he's offering. Premise 1, the courts deserve our respect. Premise 2, we demonstrate respect by behaving justly. Premise 3, people who beg for their lives act unjustly. Conclusion, therefore, people should behave justly and not beg for their lives in court. Here's another one, right? This is when he proposes that his alternative punishment should be free meals for life because he hasn't done anything wrong. He's actually done a service, right? I think it's a little tongue-in-cheek that he's making this argument, but we could still map it out. How does it work logically, right? He says, number 1, punishments should fit the crime. He says, number 2, I haven't committed a crime. I performed a service. He says, premise 3, the service should earn a reward, not a punishment, right? We don't punish people for doing good things. We reward them. 4, the quality of the reward should fit the extent of the service. So if I've done something small, I get a small reward. If I do something big, I do a big reward. Premise 5, my service is of the greatest importance to the city. Conclusion, therefore, I should not receive a great punishment. I should receive a great reward. Meletus and the other prosecutors would probably take issue with premise 2 and probably take issue with premise 5. But they would probably concede that premise 1, premise 3, and premise 4 are true. They just would take issue, I think, with premise 2 and 5. Here's another one. Socrates tells the jury there's no logical reason for anyone to be afraid of death. The syllogism would look like this. People should only be afraid of the things that harm them. Premise 2, death is either a deep sleep or a journey of the soul to another realm. Premise 3, deep sleeps and journeys of the soul are not harmful. Conclusion, people should not be afraid of death. Remember that if you want to refute an enthymeme, you got to map it. You got to figure out what the premises are. You want to refute any kind of logical argument, you got to map what its structure is. This allows you to see each of the parts of the argument. And then that will allow you to identify where the argument goes wrong. The final concept with the logos appeal is called the unity of the argument. This is the overarching concept, right? It takes into consideration all the previous 5. The entire argument, start to finish, all the reasons, all the evidence, all of the everything, being strong, being sound, being correct, can be thought of as the unity of the argument. Do all the logical components work together? Are there any contradictions? Is the argument complete? Have you addressed the counter arguments? Do you have a balance of evidence and a balance of internal logic, or enthymeme-based reasoning? When you think about, does the whole argument succeed? How is the thesis ultimately advanced? That's called the unity of the argument. So in review, the logos appeal for Aristotle involves logic, reasoning. He thinks it's the most important of all the skills. He says there are 2 ways the logos appeal functions. It functions by example, looking out in the world for evidence to support your claim, and enthymeme, looking inward at the inner principles. That's deductive reasoning. And we've walked through some qualities of the good logos appeal. They include having good evidence to support your position, inference to the best explanation when necessary, using analogies, practicing consistency, or explaining what a relevant difference would be, understanding syllogisms and how they work together, and finally, the unity of the argument, how the whole thing functions as an argument. We've talked about examples of each of these from the defense, and next week we will turn to Socrates in the Crito to specifically map some of his arguments using syllogisms. And we'll talk about whether those arguments stand up to our logical scrutiny.